what I'd like to do is say, Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the nomination of Bill Wehrum to be EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation. We have seen this movie before, but like many sequels, this one may actually be worse than the original. My opposition to this nominee should not come as a surprise to my colleagues or to Mr. Wehrum, because in 2005, President George W. Bush nominated him for the exact same position, Air Administrator for Clean Air for Radiation at EPA. I opposed his nomination at that time, as did many of our colleagues, and he was not confirmed. Prior to his nomination prior to his nomination in 2005, Mr. Wehrum was an industry lawyer and later a political employee at the EPA. He served as chief counsel to Jeff Homestead, then the acting assistant administrator for air and radiation from 2001 through 2005. And while serving at EPA at this time, Mr. Wehrum had a concerning track record of suppressing scientific information and the work of the EPA career staff, deferring to industry on issues of public health, and not responding to my colleagues and to me when we were then serving on the Environment and Public Works Committee. President Bush eventually nominated Mr. Wehrum to fill Jeff Homestead's seat and to serve in an acting capacity as Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at EPA, something Mr. Wehrum would not be able to lawfully do today. We have here behind me to my left, Mr. President, an editorial from, I think it was 2006, April 2006, the New York Times they published an editorial opposing Mr. Wehram's nomination that mirrored my concerns at the time. And I quote from this editorial: "The Homestead era at EPA will be remembered chiefly for its efforts to weaken the Clean Air Act, particularly with respect to rules governing mercury emissions in older power plants, to manipulate science and to elevate corporate interests above those of the public. Mr. Wehrum, who served as Mr. Homestead's deputy and doctrinal hitman, could make things worse." Close quote. That's a direct quote from this editorial. Mr. President, remember, this is the New York Times editorial from 2006, opposing Mr. Wehram's nomination for the very same position that he seeks today. During the Environment and Public Works Committee's consideration of Mr. Wehram's nomination in 2005, I voted against him because I feared he would continue to fail our clean air and protect public health. Despite the fact that Mr. Wehrum was not confirmed due to his inability to secure the 60 votes needed for cloture on his nomination, he was able to serve as acting assistant administrator for EPA's Air Office for 2 years. Since leaving the EPA, Mr. Wehrum has returned to industry and serves as an industry lawyer in litigation against EPA. Since returning to the private sector, Mr. Wehrum has reflected on his time spent at EPA. Doing so, he didn't point to the good work he did at the agency to advance public health mission or the lasting protections he helped put in place that made a difference in the lives of ordinary citizens. Instead, he noted that his tenure at EPA was really good for business, saying, and I quote him, here's what he said. He said, "I'm a much better lawyer now than when I first joined the agency. To really get to know how the agency works and how it ticks, I think that is very valuable. I've expanded my capabilities, which will hopefully allow me to be effective in generating business and clients." In generating business and clients. End of quote. Sadly, my fears in 2005 were well-founded, and only one thing has changed. One thing has changed. The Senate rules with respect to the number of votes we need to consider and confirm a nominee. If Mr. Wehrum is confirmed this week, it will be because he is the beneficiary of the Senate's elimination of the requirement that 60 votes are needed to consider nominees. It will not be because he's any better suited for this important job. Mr. President, let me walk through some telling numbers with you and our colleagues this evening. First number, 31. 31 is the number of times that Mr. Wehrum has represented industry against the EPA in federal court since 2009, 31 times. Let me be very clear on this. After serving in an unconfirmed capacity at EPA for 6 years because he was too far outside the mainstream to be confirmed by this body, Mr. Wehrum then left the agency and has spent his years since then suing that very same agency and attempting to weaken environmental and public health protections on behalf of his industry clients. Many of these lawsuits are still ongoing, and in the majority of the pending lawsuits, Mr. Wehrum has represented the interests of big oil. Let's look at another poster here. Number 27. Well, what's 27? Refers to the number of times that public health groups prevailed in court when challenging Bush-era clean air regulations that Mr. Wehrum helped to craft because they did not follow the law or sufficiently protect public health. Failing to follow the Clean Air Act intent meant delays in public health protections and uncertainty for businesses across America. Now, I don't doubt that Mr. Wehrum is a fine lawyer, so why were so many of his rules, the rules he helped to write, found to be unlawful? The confirmation process is essentially a job interview. Not a job interview with EPA, in a sense, not really a job interview with us, but just as much a job interview with the American people. In this case, Mr. Wehrum is essentially applying for the job he already had at EPA, and you'd think that would be easy. But Mr. Wehram's resume shows that a great deal of the work that he did in his last job as acting assistant administrator for air and radiation was not up to par. And in this job, subpar work impacts millions of Americans, especially children and the most vulnerable among us. Next number. Number 10. 10 is the number of additional years that children were exposed to toxic air emissions from power plants because of delays Mr. Wehrum helped put into place while at the EPA. Next, number 8. Number 8 refers to the number of days before Mr. Wehrum's latest confirmation hearing that he was in a courtroom arguing against rules that would protect 2.3 million miners, construction workers, and bricklayers. According to Mr. Wehrum, people are, and I quote him, people are designed to deal with dust. People are in dusty apartments all the time, and it doesn't kill them. End of quote. Next number is 2. Number of times the D.C. Circuit Court cited Alice in Wonderland in its decisions to reject EPA rules that Mr. Wehrum helped craft, because in the court's view, the regulations were based on fantasy rather than following the rule of law. Next number is 1. 1 is a number of times that language from a law firm that represented industry and also happened to be Mr. Wehrum's former employer made it verbatim into a clean air regulation that Mr. Wehrum stated he was extensively involved in preparing. Think about that. 0. The number of times that Mr. Wehrum advocated in court for stronger clean air regulations since leaving the EPA. Especially a troubling number for those of us living in downwind states like Delaware. We live at the end of America's tailpipe along with our neighbors in Maryland and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, New York, and folks all the way up to Maine. 0 is also the number of times that Mr. Wehrum expressed a desire to protect public health when I met with him prior to his confirmation hearing. Mr. President, Mr. Wehrum sits before us again today, nominated for the very same position he was nominated for 12 years ago. After reviewing Mr. Wehrum's record, talking to him in person and listening and reading his answers during the hearing process, my position has not changed since 2005, primarily because his views do not appear to have changed. Like other EPA nominees, Mr. Wehrum was evasive on many of the questions asked of him, even convincingly forgetting a case that he worked on against the renewable fuel standard in National Chicken Council et al. Versus EPA. However, what was clear in the answers that he did give and and his conversation with me is that public health simply is not Mr. Wehrum's main concern. In fact, when asked what Clean Air Act regulation he does support, he answered, and I quote, these are his words, "I represent clients in private practice. It is my legal, ethical duty to zealously represent their interests." Close quote. Well, in this job interview with the American people, this interview to be the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, the American people are his clients. And the fact that he cannot or has refused to name a single regulation that helps to ensure that they and their families have clean air to breathe is almost disqualifying in and of itself. But whether it's carbon, whether it's mercury pollution, silica, or other toxic air pollution, Mr. Wehrum continues to show he sides with polluters over science and doctors every time. Mr. Wehrum's extreme views will not be good for public health, and quite frankly, the legal uncertainty that has resulted from his past work will not be good for American businesses. Businesses need certainty and predictability. I hear this for years, and they don't get it with this kind of work that he's done. Mr. President, let me close by reminding our colleagues, that next week we celebrate the 27th anniversary of the signing of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, 27 years. 27 years ago, we weren't debating how to weaken or delay our clean air laws. Instead, we passed bipartisan legislation that would improve and strengthen our clean air laws based on the very best science. And in the process, we strengthened our economy too. 89 senators, including some who still serve in this chamber, voted to approve the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. As a congressman over in the other body, at that time I voted along with them. And Republican President then, George Herbert Walker Bush, signed the bill into law 27 years ago today. Think about that, 27 years ago today. It was common sense legislation, it was bipartisan, and we're all the better for it. Mr. President, when the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 passed Congress, as I said, I was a congressman in the House. I voted in favor of that bill. I was proud to be part of helping to pass that monumental law because I believe then, and I still believe today, that we can protect our environment, we can grow our economy at the same time, and we have the job numbers to prove it. Well, Mr. President, we've had some delays in implementation, but by and large, the law has been a huge success and has benefited just about every American. For every dollar we spend installing new pollution controls and cleaning up our air, we've seen $30 returned in reduced healthcare costs, better workplace productivity, and saved lives. $30 return in every dollar that we spend installing new pollution controls. The bottom line is fewer people are getting sick and missing work because of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. When it comes to the rhetoric surrounding clean air regulations, there's a lot of fake news that people like to peddle. But, Mr. President, as the saying goes, everyone is entitled to his or her own opinion, but not to his or her own facts. And here are the facts. Our economy did not take a slide because of clean air protections. Quite the opposite is true. The Obama administration implemented the Clean Air Act based on the best science to date, and now our air is cleaner, and we have seen 8 years of economic growth. I'll say it again. We have seen 8 years of economic growth, the longest stretch in our history. And energy prices at the pump and the meter were lower than when President Obama took office. Lower, not higher. The beauty of our clean air laws is that they are not static. Our clean air protections keep up with the latest science and the latest technology. And as we learn more about what makes us sick, about what is impacting our environment, and about what can be done to clean it up, the EPA has the authority under the Clean Air Act to make adjustments, to make it to make it better, to ensure that it protects more people, not fewer. And that has been the trajectory to date. As technology and science develop, so do our clean air regulations. That's also the story of our country. Through innovative and creative solutions, we strive for progress in order to have a better life here at home and to lead the world in tackling the environmental challenges of our time. Mr. Wehram's policies have been tried and have been proven not only unsuccessful, but even dangerous. We don't need to continue to move backwards. We need to move forward. So, Mr. President, I leave you and our colleagues with this. I'm sorry to say that Mr. Wehrum has worked deliberately to halt that practice, to delay that progress, and to roll back the clean air laws that have been protecting America and Americans for decades. Unlike many of the nominees who have come before us this year, unfortunately, we don't have to speculate about how Mr. Wehrum would do in this position. We've already seen it. We've already seen it. And the results were not good for the rest of us. As his clients at this time, we deserve better representation. Today, Americans deserve leaders at EPA who will be impartial and look out for the interest of all Americans, not just big oil and the powerful clients who can afford Mr. Wehram's legal bills. Mr. President, we've seen this movie before. There's no need for a sequel. I regret having to say that, but I do believe Mr. Wehrum is not the right fit for this position today, any more than he was a dozen years ago. And I encourage my colleagues to vote no on his nomination to serve as EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air, and I reserve the balance of my time.
From Delaware.
Does the senator from Illinois seek recognition? No? Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Mr. President, I want to, good morning. I wanted to continue to share with our colleagues the reasons why I oppose the nomination of Bill Wehrum to be EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation. Throughout his career, Mr. Wehrum has clearly shown that he is dismissive of the science that is at the core of EPA's actions to protect public health. Nothing during this confirmation process has convinced me that Mr. Wehram's approach will change going forward. I've said this before, and I'll say it again because it makes Mr. Wehram's priorities clear. Our courts have overturned regulations that Mr. Wehrum helped craft while at EPA a staggering 27 times. That's 27 times that the courts determined that the rules that Mr. Wehrum put in place did not follow the law or did not adequately protect public safety. 27 times. In one of those instances, the courts faulted EPA's lack of action to reduce mercury and air toxic pollution emissions from electric power plants. Mr. President, I've worked on controlling mercury pollution since I became a member of this body 17 years ago. So I'd like to spend some time talking about this issue, mercury. Much of our country's ongoing efforts to clean up air pollution hinge on making sure that every state plays by the rules and does their fair share to reduce air pollution. That includes dangerous, toxic pollution like mercury. Toxic air pollution gets in the air we breathe, gets into the food we eat, builds up in our bodies without our knowledge, and can lead to cancer, to mental impairment, and even to death. Unfortunately, Mr. Wehrum has spent much of his career fighting to dismantle the federal environmental protections on which any state, my state, your state, so many other states depend in order to clean up toxic air pollution. Mr. President, as I've mentioned before, 27 is also the number of years ago that President George Herbert Walker Bush signed the 1990 Clean Air Act's amendments into law. Nearly 3 decades ago, Congress had enough scientific data to know that mercury and other air toxics, such as lead and arsenic, were hazardous air pollutants that harm people's health and, as a result, should be regulated by the EPA. The lawmakers, including myself, who sent the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 to the desk of a Republican president, thought that the nation's largest emitters of mercury and air toxics would soon be required to do their part and clean up. Unfortunately, it took 22 additional years for the EPA to issue the mercury and air toxics rule. Another 22 years passed, which finally, 5 years ago, it finally called for reducing mercury and other air toxics from coal-fired plants, our nation's largest source of mercury emissions. The EPA modeled the rule after successful steps that states across our country had already taken. The agency required coal plants to install existing affordable technology that could reduce mercury and toxic emissions by 90%. Today, our nation's power utilities are meeting the mercury and air toxic standards, meeting it. And electricity prices have not gone up, they've gone down. Some of you might find that hard to believe, but it's true. They've actually gone down. Mr. President, you might ask why it took EPA 22 years to address our nation's largest sources of mercury and air toxics emissions. That's a fair question. The answer, in part, is that Mr. Wehrum was working at the EPA and had the responsibility to assume this life-enhancing, if not life-saving task, a responsibility, sadly, that he largely chose to ignore. In the early 2000s, under Mr. Wehrum's leadership, the EPA decided to take a detour when it came to regulating mercury and air toxics from power plants. Mr. Wehrum refused to follow the recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences and instead reversed an earlier EPA decision. He determined that it was neither appropriate nor necessary to regulate power plants under the air toxic section of the Clean Air Act. Instead, he chose a different path, helping to write a rule allowing power plants to pollute more and for a longer time under a mercury cap and trade program. In his push to make regulations on mercury emissions less protective, Mr. Wehrum promulgated a rule that industry not only supported, but helped to write. Mr. President, in January 2004, the Washington Post reported that language written for industry by Mr. Wehrum's old law firm, Latham & Watkins, appeared word for word in the proposed rule published in the Federal Register, word for word. The story reported, and I quote, a side-by-side comparison of one of the three proposed rules and the memorandum prepared by Latham & Watkins shows that at least a dozen paragraphs were listed, sometimes verbatim, from the industry's suggestion, close quote. After Mr. Wehrum's mercury rule was finalized, the federal courts found that EPA had exaggerated the rule's benefits, and as a result, the rule was overturned. In fact, the EPA lost so badly that the deciding judge said that the agency deployed, quote, and I'm quoting the judge, the agency deployed, under the leadership of Mr. Wehrum, the logic of the Queen of Hearts, substituting EPA's desires for the plain text of the law, close quote. So EPA had to start all over again because Mr. Wehrum ignored science and deferred to industry. What makes that delayed process so egregious is that our nation's children were exposed to toxic air emissions from power plants for an additional decade for no good reason. In 2011, the Obama administration finally issued a new rule, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard Rule, that protects our children, protects our health, and protects our lakes and our rivers. What's more, our industry is easily able to meet the rule's targets, and our nation is already seeing the benefits. But these health benefits do not seem to matter to Mr. Wehrum. We're still fighting for delays in mercury and air toxic emission reductions. In fact, while representing his industry clients, he has supported a lawsuit against the mercury and air toxics rule. Under his leadership, Mr. Wehrum's law firm has been arguing that it is not, quote, appropriate and necessary, close quote, for the EPA to regulate mercury and other air toxic emissions. Not appropriate and necessary? That's what he says. When I asked Mr. Wehrum about his time at the EPA and his work to delay mercury regulations, he was elusive, seemed to have a selective memory with respect to the actions he did or did not take when he last served at the EPA. When I asked him if he would commit not to weaken the mercury and air toxics rule if confirmed, he basically refused to answer. However, to his colleagues, he is very clear regarding his thoughts on the mercury and air toxics rule. In a trade press article published just 1 year ago, Mr. Wehrum said, and I quote, "From our perspective, It's a regulation that made no sense and wasn't justified. End of his quote. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution. Pollution that pediatricians tell us damage children's brains and could affect up to 600,000 newborns every year. 600,000 newborns every year. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution. Pollution that settles, again, in our lakes or rivers, streams, accumulates in our fish, makes them too dangerous to eat. Mr. Wehrum believes there is no justification for EPA to regulate the largest source of mercury and air toxic pollution, even though power companies have already bought, paid for, and installed the control technology on all power plants without hiking electricity rates. Mr. President, this information should be quite concerning to all of us, to all of our colleagues. I don't care where we come from, especially those who have supported the mercury and air toxic rules, as many of us have. If confirmed, Mr. Wehrum would be part of the review of the mercury and air toxics rule that Mr. Pruitt promises to undertake. Think about that. This is just one of the many clear examples in which Mr. Wehrum continues to support polluters over science and doctors, even going so far as to give polluters the pen to write the regulations they would have to follow. Unfortunately, there are many more. Mr. Wehrum also spearheaded regulations when he was last at EPA that weakened air pollution protection for our national parks. The courts threw out those efforts to weaken the so-called regional haze rule, compelling the Obama administration to clean up his mess and provide this protection for iconic parks like Grand Canyon and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Because again, Mr. Wehrum did not follow science or the law. Nonetheless, Mr. Wehrum continues to pursue ongoing litigation against EPA's efforts to reduce national park pollution. Last year, Mr. Wehrum declared in an article, and I quote him again, EPA used the regional haze program to impose very stringent, and from our perspective, unwarranted emissions requirements. End of quote. Mr. President, Mr. Wehrum also has a long history of ignoring climate change science and the laws that regulate carbon emissions. While at the EPA, Mr. Wehrum was critical of the agency's decisions to deny the state of California's waiver to impose stricter vehicle standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as costs for consumers. Mr. Wehrum personally pushed for this action against the recommendations of the career staff, who did not believe the George W. Bush administration political appointee had a legal basis to deny California's request. I'm here today to remind Mr. Wehrum and all those who continue to delay action to control greenhouse gas emissions under the premise that more information about how the climate is changing or whether or not human beings are exacerbating this effect of climate change. The facts are in. Science is clear. But even if he doesn't want to believe the numbers and the data, Mr. Wehrum lives in Delaware, as do I. We run races together, sometimes ride the same trains back and forth between Wilmington and Washington. But the state in which we both reside, for us, the effects of climate change are evident in our state. We are the nation's lowest lying state. Parts of our state are sinking, while at the same time, the waters are rising along our shores. By his own admission, while at EPA, Mr. Wehrum provided support to the government litigation in the famous case Massachusetts versus EPA. That team argued that greenhouse gases are not pollutants that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Well, it's not just me who disagreed with Mr. Wehrum in this instance. The Supreme Court of the United States disagreed as well. Unfortunately, Mr. Wehram's views on climate change seem to be the same as they were 15 years ago. And despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA, which affirmed EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, Mr. Wehrum insisted in 2013 that he, and I quote him again, continues to believe that Congress never intended for the EPA to address an issue such as climate change under the Clean Air Act, close quote. His nomination hearing before the EPW committee, Mr. Wehrum claimed that the climate is changing, but much is unknown. Much is unknown about why and how fast those changes are occurring. Mr. President, I could go on for a while, as you can imagine. But suffice it to say that these views, his views, those of Mr. Wehrum, are not just curious, they're dangerous. They are dangerous. Ignoring environmental health science just because you'd rather not put protections in place hurt all of us in the end, but especially the most vulnerable among us. Mr. Wehrum's time at EPA is at odds with the public health mission of that agency. All the failed regulations that Mr. Wehrum worked on created greater uncertainty for business and left the lives of the most vulnerable populations at risk. Mr. President, I'd like to close by reflecting on why I think today's vote is so important. My wife Martha and I go to church, Presbyterian Church in Wilmington most Sundays. Early this year, on an especially lovely spring morning, a morning I'd gone out for a run, we joined our congregation in singing a number of hymns, and one of them began with these words: "For the beauty of the earth, for the glory of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise." It's a powerful passage, and we should let these words really and truly resonate, especially on this morning. Scripture reminds us repeatedly to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we all call that the golden rule. It appears in every major religion in the world. I don't care if you're Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. I don't care what your faith is. There's a golden rule in your sacred scriptures. In our faith, we call it the golden rule. Also found in those pages is another sacred obligation that we're to serve as stewards of this planet to which we've been entrusted, that we have a moral obligation to do so. I know a great many of our colleagues here in the Senate agree that we have a responsibility to care for the world around us and the people who live on it. Most Americans believe that. We all have an obligation to protect the health of our children and our families and the world in which we live. We have an obligation to ensure that we have clean air to breathe, perhaps the most basic, most important right of all. For me, this is not only my responsibility as a parent and as an official elected to serve the people of Delaware, it is a moral imperative, a moral calling. Americans deserve EPA leaders who believe in sound science. Americans need EPA leaders who will listen to our medical experts when it comes to our health, and who will be able to strike a balance that ensures both a cleaner environment and a stronger economy, something we have done for the past 27 years since the adoption of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Moving forward with this nominee and thus allowing him to execute his extreme agenda once again at the EPA, especially when we have seen how poorly he handled that authority before, would be, in my mind, simply irresponsible. I do not believe Mr. Wehrum is the right fit for this position. I encourage my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, to vote no on his nomination to be EPA's Assistant Administrator for Air. Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time. President, as we prepare to vote on this nominee, I want to implore my colleagues to take one last minute to think about this decision before us. I ask them to recall the words I said just a bit earlier this morning from the hymn that Martha and I heard at our church, not far from our home in Wilmington, Delaware. Earlier this spring, beautiful spring morning. It's a song, a hymn that I think we all know. For the beauty of the earth, for the glory of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies, Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. That powerful message reminds me of the incredible responsibility that we have in this body, to serve and to protect the people who sent us here. We must serve as stewards also of this planet, which has been entrusted to us for the most vulnerable among us. And for me, that's not just my responsibility as a parent or as an official elected to serve the people of my state for all these years. It is a moral imperative, I think a sacred obligation. There's perhaps no more basic human need than having clean air to breathe. I implore my colleagues, our colleagues, we've already seen Mr. Wehram's extreme agenda at the EPA once before. It would be at the height of irresponsibility and shirking our moral obligation to confirm him here today. And I implore you, join me in voting no on Bill Wehrum. Thank you very much.